slick talker since a jet.
Winter time, all the time, ooh, yeah. Look at the way that I move, swag. Disrespectful and I'm rude, okay. I had cocaine in the school.
Yo, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the second part to What If Asta Was an Elf. Now at the moment of this recording, the first part of this is already more successful than my last two videos, so I thank you for that. And I hope you guys continue to support this series. Also at the making of this video, we're at 969 subscribers. Nice. So if you enjoy the content, make sure you subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000. Also, my Discord is linked in the description below. You can talk to me personally, you can see sneak peeks, you can see the progress of What Ifs, and in fact, you can play a big role in what happens in What Ifs by giving me recommendations. So yeah, my Discord and everything else is linked in the description below. Without further ado, thank you guys so much for the support on this series, and let's get into it. Now, the last place I left off, the kingdom was attacked by the Eye of the Midnight Sun, but in the end, everything unfolded like in canon, and everything was all said and well, besides the fact Fuegoleon lost an arm. So let's pick up a little bit after that. A few days after the Eye of the Midnight Sun attacked the kingdom, Finrod would be skulking around the hideout, looking for people to take to a mixer. And everyone he observed had a complete busted personality, and they would completely ruin the mixer. Until he came to his last two options, Asta and Luck. Finrod would immediately decide to take Asta since he was the only other squad member that was actually pretty handsome and had a pretty normal personality. And with no other choice, he decided to take Luck as well. Finrod would group the two up and he would tell them that they were going on a mixer. Luck would be confused on what a mixer even was, and Asta would think the whole situation was dumb. Finrod would create a portal and they would all three walk through. And much like in canon, before the portal could close, Noel would also sneak through it. And the mixer would commence just like in canon. But this time around, Asta being quite handsome and knowing how a mixer works, the mixer would go much better than it did in canon. He would keep everything lively by telling them stories about how his missions went. He would also be kind to them, and despite him not wanting to be here, he kept everything going pretty smoothly for Finrod's sake. And much like in canon, Finrod would swoop in and he would hit it off with one of the women. Luck would also do the same thing, but he would do his unintentional. And Finrod and Luck would leave the mixer table, leaving only Rebecca and Asta. And in this What If, Rebecca was actually interested in Asta, so she would begin to talk to him about her siblings. Asta would explain that he lived in an orphanage with a bunch of orphan children and they were kind of like his siblings. The two would form a friendly relationship over the concept, and she would tell him that he could come by tonight and see her siblings. Asta didn't see why he shouldn't, and he didn't really want to turn the girl down, so he would agree to this. So they would go back to the restaurant she works at, and there he would see all of her siblings. She would make some food for him, and he would compliment how good it was. And while he was messing around with Rebecca's siblings, it reminded him of the orphan children at the church. While this was happening, Luck and Finrod would mess up on their dates, and they would be looking around for Asta. But Finrod thought that Asta got lucky with that other red-haired girl, so he would simply send himself and Luck back to the base. About an hour would pass, and Asta would finally leave Rebecca and her siblings. Asta would then look around for Luck and Finrod so he could get back to the base. He would do this for a flat 30 minutes to no avail, until finally he would run across Noelle, and she'd be asking him what he was doing with that girl. Asta would say nothing, and more importantly, what the hell are you doing here? Noelle would be scrambling to make up an excuse, but while she was doing this, the temperature would drop and they would be able to physically see their breaths, as snow would begin to fall from the sky. Yes, I'm aware this isn't supposed to happen now, but I am intervening with the story and letting it happen a bit early for reasons. As Noelle and Asta were looking around trying to figure out why it was snowing, since it's not even winter, people began to run out of their houses asking where their children were. As then Rebecca also ran out of her house asking where her two younger siblings were. Asta would run up to her and ask her exactly what was going on, and she would explain her little sister and little brother were gone. Asta would then reach down to the ground picking up some snow as he would crumble it between his fingers. He could immediately tell this was not organic snow, it was a spell. Noelle would run up behind Asta asking him what they should do. Asta would begin to sense around as he would sense individual small mana sources all grouped up together. He would then tell Noelle if him and the kids weren't back by 5 to 10 minutes, call for backup. As then he would set off toward the mountain, but he would quickly be stopped by a nun. This would be Sister Teresa. Sister Teresa would explain that she was going to accompany Asta to help him get the children back. She would also explain that she was a formidable flame mage back in the day, so she could definitely be some help to him. And since Noelle and him are the only magic knights here, he isn't really in the position to turn down help. So Asta and Sister Teresa would set off toward the mountains to find the children. Eventually they would make it to the entrance of the caves and they would see Rebecca's little brother. Sister Teresa would use her burning candle recovery and Asta would give him his robe and tell him that everything was going to be alright. As in from there they would enter the cave, and after a little bit of searching they would eventually run across all the children, Barrow and Nedge. Barrow would get pissed off and yell at Nedge for allowing people to follow them, as then he would tell Nedge to attack them. Nedge would then frantically throw around snow attacks at Asta, but Asta would easily dodge them, summoning a demon destroyer sword to his hand and blitzing past all the snow attacks. Asta would appear beside Nedge, kneeing him in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him and sending him to the ground. But while Asta was doing this, Barrow would already have signaled for Sally. Asta would quickly flick around toward Barrow, sending an air slash from his demon destroyer sword toward him that would actually cut him across the chest and send him into the wall. While Asta was handling these two, Sister Teresa would be handling the children, getting them out of the cave. Asta would restrain the two as he would then help the kids get out of the cave with Sister Teresa. And just in time as well, as they sent off the last two kids, a portal would open up and someone would come out of it. They would be wearing an Eye of the Midnight Sun robe, and this would be Sally. Asta would tell Sister Teresa to make it out of the cave and take all the children back to their parents, and also to reassure to Noelle that backup probably wasn't going to be needed. Sister Teresa would be hesitant, but she would eventually leave the cave, taking all the children back to the village. But while Asta was talking to Sister Teresa, Sally would do what she did in canon, stabbing Barrow with the syringe, injecting him, boosting his magical power, but also turning him into a mud monster. Asta saying this would think quickly as his grimoire would be summoned and he would hold his hand into the air, as then a ginormous light sword would summon above him at the roof of the cave. Asta would then bring his hand down as he would say light sword of conviction, and along with his hand, so would the sword come down, and it would lodge into the chest of the mud monster. Asta would clench his hand closed as the light sword would then explode. This would completely destroy the mud monster, stopping it from regenerating, and completely leveling the cave. Sally would look upon this, being amazed, as then Asta in one flash of light would appear beside her, slicing her across the shoulder and kicking her down to the ground. Asta would drop down to the ground himself as he was getting ready to restrain Sally, but before he could, one flash of light would appear and Sally's body would disappear. As the bright light would fade away, he would see some man holding Sally, and beside him there would be Valtos. This man would obviously be Patri posing as Licht. Licht would place Sally back into Valtos' portal as she would be teleported away. From here, Patri would introduce himself to Asta as Licht, the leader of the Eye of the Midnight Sun. He would then say to Asta that he might have attacked and injured one of his compatriots, but he could be forgiven. Asta would ask him why he was being so friendly, which he would reply with that they were the same. He would then extend his hand out and ask Asta to join him on his journey to revive the others, and also help him wipe out the humans who wronged them so long ago. He would explain with Asta's help, gathering the magic stones would be far, far easier. Asta would think about how the kingdom was attacked by the Eye of the Midnight Sun and all the ones that were injured, including Voigolion. Asta would then speak up and say, I don't really know what you mean by we're the same, and I'm sorry for whatever happened to you a long time ago, but my morale won't be shaken that easily. I'm not joining you. Patri would pull his hand back in and he would say, what an unfortunate choice. As then light spears would summon behind Patri and they would begin to fly toward Asta. Asta would then create light orbs, sending them towards Patri's light spears as they would collide, creating huge explosions. This would go on for a minute or two and it would be a complete stalemate of them just throwing light projectiles at each other. Asta would immediately come to the conclusion that he would have to use something that this guy didn't have, sword magic. And he would also know that he needed to get rid of that spatial mage. He could become a problem. Asta would then summon a demon dweller sword in one of his hands and he would drop his light orb. This would allow Patri's light spears to come at Asta. And with this, he would swiftly cut through all of them, absorbing them with his demon dweller sword. He would then point his demon dweller sword at Valtos and Patri and release it. This would send a massive light beam at the two. Patri would simply flash out of the way of it, but it would be too fast for Valtos. He would get caught up in the beam and he would be severely injured and blown back. As Patri looked upon this, Asta would come blitzing out of the smoke with his demon destroyer and demon dweller sword. He would then swing at Patri with both of his swords, but Patri would summon a light sword, blocking these slashes just barely. But eventually Asta would cut through the light sword as Patri would flash away. Patri, seeing that Asta was trying to make this fight close range, he knew he had to end it quickly because he had no chance of beating Asta at close range. Patri would then flash away as far as possible as he would gather as much mana as he could, as a huge light orb would begin to form above his head. He would bring down his hands as a huge light beam would be shot toward Asta. Asta would then say, using large-scale attacks against me isn't particularly the smartest thing you could do, as he would put up his Demon Dweller sword, absorbing the light beam. Asta would now pull back his Demon Dweller sword that is chocked full of light mana as he would thrust it forward, sending out the light beam 10 times its original strength. And this attack was way too large to dodge, and Patri would be hit by it head-on. Patri would plummet to the ground, surprisingly being alive but being extremely injured. Asta would begin to walk toward Patri, but he would suddenly stop as he felt a huge wave of mana and a black portal would open up. Asta was sure he got rid of the spatial mage, yet a portal was being used, and from the portal 3 people would emerge. This would be the third eye, Veto, Fauna, and Raya. Fauna would quickly tend to Patri's injuries, wrapping him in Phoenix robe, healing him. And from there, Patri would introduce Asta to the third eye. Veto the despair, Fauna the hateful, and Raya the disloyal. Asta would look at the 3 with a lazy look as he would say under his breath, "I'm never going with Finrod on another mixer ever again." Fauna would say she would kill Asta for hurting Licht. Veto would scoff at him and say, "How dare you defile your own kind." Raya would simply yawn before creating a light sword and saying, "You had your chance, too bad you didn't join us." And also by this time, like in canon, Noelle would have called for backup because Asta was taking way too long just to beat one person. Seke would obviously pick up and he would notify the Black Bulls and a bunch of other squads about the situation. But back in the cave, a fight between the third eye and Asta would commence. Fauna would shoot multiple fireballs from her salamander at Asta, and Asta would simply absorb them with the Demon Dweller sword. But while he was doing this, Veto would appear in front of him, slashing down with his claws. This would cause Asta to bring his Demon Destroyer sword up, blocking this attack. As a black portal would appear behind Asta, and Raya would come out of it with a light sword. He would swing at Asta, causing Asta to knock Veto away and dodge this attack just narrowly. As then Asta would be forced to go on the defensive, just dodging and blocking attacks. But Asta would immediately note that Fauna was probably useless without her salamander. He also noted that Veto's whole arsenal was based around physical attacks, meaning it wasn't anything too intricate, meaning he could keep up with it. And Raya was definitely using copy magic, which sounds very strong in theory, but you're merely copying from someone else, meaning you probably don't know the original strengths and weaknesses of the magic you copied. As then he would take a look at Licht, and he would notice that Licht's magic was very unstable. In fact, just one more hit to Licht would probably drive him out of control. As Asta would take one deep breath, and the entire atmosphere would shift. Veto would blitz toward Asta, trying to attack him again, but Asta would easily dodge this, slicing him across the chest. As then he would kick Veto in the stomach, sending him flying into the wall of the cave. And then he would start to head toward Fauna and Patri. But he would be blindsided by Raya with a light sword, and little did Raya know, light magic can be easily counteracted by more light magic. As then Asta would make his own sword of light, slamming into Raya's sword of light, making a huge explosion. Asta teleported out of the blast radius, but Raya got hit point blank and he would be sent flying back. And Asta, conveniently enough, would have teleported right behind Patri. He would point his Demon Dweller sword that was still full of Salamander's fire magic, and he would say, "It's quite ironic that you want to protect him so much, but it's your magic that might kill him." As then he would release it, and a huge blast of fire would be sent toward Patri. It would hit him, but he wouldn't die by it since he was protected by the Phoenix robe. But it would be enough to converge his magic, causing him to self-destruct. But before he could actually self-destruct, Fauna, Veto, and Raya would all surround him using the sealing magic. As they were sealing away his mana, stopping him from self-destructing, pages in Asta's grimoire would begin to flip as it would flip to a page that actually had a sword magic spell on it. Asta would say, "I've been waiting to use this spell, but it does take a lot out of me." But right before Asta got to use the spell, Raya would summon a portal under all of them and Voltos, and he would teleport them away. Asta would immediately cancel his spell as he would fall down to one knee exhausted. As just then, a portal would open up and outcome would be Yami and Finrod. They would ask what happened to him, and he would explain that the Eye of the Midnight Sun attacked. But he really wouldn't say much more, and the arc from here on would pretty much progress as usual. The very next day, Asta and Yami would go and give a report, and Asta would be doing all the talking since he was the only one that came in contact with the enemy. He would describe the leader of the Eye of the Midnight Sun, Licht, quote-unquote. He would also explain the third eye, Fauna, Raya, and Veto. He would also explain that they were gathering magic stones, and they were talking about reviving the others. And this would all make sense to Julius since he already ran across the tablet with all the magic stones in it. Julius would also piece together the guy he ran into in their hideout had to be licked since he was using light magic, just as Asta described. So Julius came to the conclusion that he had to get to the magic stones before they could. So the next day he would hold a captain's meeting and he would relay the exact same information that Asta gave to him to all the captains. And much like in canon, he would hold Yami back and he would give Yami and his squad the mission to go to the underwater temples and locate a magic stone. Also, the whole ordeal with the Purple Orca's captain would happen and he would be captured. And Julius would get all the same information that he did in canon, but Asta wouldn't break the spell, Marx would. And with that, Julius would get the information about the magic stones, the Purple Orca's captain, and the information about the Eye of the Midnight Sun, which lined up with Asta's details. Later that day, Yami would tell the Black Bulls that they were going to Rockaway Beach. Everyone would be excited and whatnot, and Noelle would obviously have her little propaganda with Vanessa on finding a swimsuit, since she wanted to appeal to Asta more than Rebecca since that whole thing happened recently. But like I said, everyone would be excited to go except for Yami and Asta since Yami understood it was a mission and so did Asta, but his mind was still fixated on the Eye of the Midnight Sun. The next day would come around and Yami would leave early just like in canon so he could go collect information about the situation they were going to be dealing with. But much like in canon, soon after, everyone else would wake up and they would set off for Rockaway Beach. Upon making it there, things would pretty much go to canon. Everyone would be running around having fun, Noelle would be trying to muster up the courage to show Asta her new swimsuit, while Asta would still be in his regular clothes and he would be looking for Yami. As then, Noelle would build up enough courage and she would come out from behind her tree as she would be met by Asta. He would point at her and say, "Nice swimsuit, it's quite shiny." She would get flustered, but both of their focuses would be broken as Yami would yell out loud to stop messing around. All the Black Bulls would gather around him as he would explain the situation much like in canon. He would explain that they had to rely on Noelle to get them down there and the tidal waves were weakest during a full moon. As the arc would pretty much progress as in canon, nothing would really change. Asta would help Noelle train every night, and they were actually making very good progress since Asta had a pretty good grip on how magic worked. But despite this, Noelle wasn't actually getting a grasp of the spell, until much like in canon they would run across Kahano. And with Kahano's advice along with Asta's advice, she would actually master her spell a lot sooner. And once she did, Kahano would seem to disappear. But a few days would pass, and the time would come for them to go down to the underwater temple. So exactly like in canon, Noelle would successfully make her sea dragon's cradle, and she would take all of the Black Bulls down, past the tidal waves, and to the actual underwater temple with no difficulty. This is because she had a much better grasp on her magic. Once they made it to the magic barrier, Yami would tell Asta to get rid of it briefly so they could get through. So Asta would create 4 Demon Dweller swords that he would stab into the barrier, absorbing a little bit of the magic, allowing them to slip through. Asta would stop his swords from absorbing the magic and it would close back up. And yes, I know you guys are probably tired of me saying this, but things would pretty much go to canon from here. The Black Bulls would meet the Sea Folk as they would explain where the High Priest was. They would meet the High Priest. The High Priest would propose a challenge to them, much like in canon, and that was if they could pass his test, they would get the magic stone. And it was only after he sent everyone in except for Yami that they learned that it was a combat test. And here you are, my friends, asking, well, why didn't they hold Asta back? He's comparable to a captain and extremely strong. All I can say to you is it's plot convenience, but at the same time it's actually really necessary. Because let's be honest with ourselves, everyone would get slaughtered in that competition by the upcoming events if they did not have Asta with them. So the competition would commence and Asta would immediately begin to run through all the other competitors. In fact, he would get rid of all of them so fast that none of the other Black Bulls had a chance to fight anyone. Until there were only 3 mages left on the Grand Priestess side. That would be Kahano, Kyoto, and their father. Noelle would run across Kahano and they would have their little scuffle. And Magma and Luck would run across Kyoto and Kahano's father as they would begin to fight much like in canon. While this was going on, Asta would be looking around for the last 3 competitors. As in things would go to hell and Veto and 4 Eye of the Midnight Sun members would come crashing through the ceiling. The 4 members of the Eye of the Midnight Sun would scatter, and Veto would stay to fight the 3 that was in front of him, this being Magma, Luck, Kyoto, and Kahano's father. And this fight would commence and it would go pretty much to canon. Kyoto and Kahano's father would get bodied immediately. Luck and Magma would then fight him and they would fare better, but they would also get bodied. But they would be able to hold him off long enough for Kyoto, Kahano, and Noelle to get there. Their fight would go as in canon and Veto would just toy with them before taking off Kyoto's leg and stabbing Kahano in the throat. And while this was happening, Asta would be trying to get to Veto, and 2 of the Eye of the Midnight Sun members would get in his way and he would end up beating them. And the other 2 were handled by Ghosh and Vanessa. And Yami, seeing all these people get handled by Veto, he would yell over the intercom at Asta to get his ass over there immediately. But just after he said this, Noelle would have her little moment and she would unlock a new spell, Sea Dragon's Roar, and with this spell she would actually take off Veto's arm just like in canon. But Veto's mana levels would only get higher as he would awaken his third eye. From here, he would use Mythical Beast Magic to regenerate his arm, as then he would use Mythical Beast Magic to send a flaming beam toward Noelle. And before it could hit her, it would stop in front of her. Once the spell was done, Asta would step into view, revealing that he absorbed it. Asta and Veto would glare at each other before Asta would speak up and he would say, "Before we fight, can I ask you a question? What exactly did the humans do to you guys for you to hate them so much?" Veto would angrily remark back at Asta that why should it matter to him, he's not even one of them anymore. As in Asta would say back, "What do you mean by that? And why is it so hard to answer my question?" And before he could finish his sentence, Veto would shoot another flaming beam at Asta, but Asta would return this by putting up his Demon Dweller sword and shooting the mana he just absorbed seconds ago. The 2 beams of mana would clash together and Asta would be easily overwhelming Veto since he was using the exact same spell but just way stronger. But while Asta was shooting the beam from his Demon Dweller sword, Veto would blitz beside him, sending claw slashes toward him. This caught Asta a bit off guard, and these claw slashes were moving very fast and they were about to hit him. But at the last second, Asta coated himself in mana using Mana Skin. He didn't really have a name for this ability since he didn't know what it was, he just knew how to use it. But once Asta was hit by the claw slashes, he would be completely fine as his Mana Skin protected him. And just about this time, he would pull his Demon Dweller sword away as he would get done shooting the beam of fire. Asta would then summon a Demon Destroyer sword to his other hand as he would stare down Veto. As now Asta would know Veto's arsenal has extended to range attacks as well, meaning Asta no longer had a clear strategy for beating Veto. Asta was just going to have to outdo Veto when it came to close and long range combat. Eventually, Asta and Veto's stare down would end and the 2 would blitz toward each other. But before they clashed, Asta closed his eyes and took a deep breath. As a whole atmosphere would change and Asta's mana would begin to overwhelm Veto's. And yes, this is Asta using Mana Zone. And for anyone wondering, he was using this to boost his physical prowess when fighting the third eye back in the cave earlier. And once again, he wouldn't call it Mana Zone because he doesn't know what it is. No one taught him how to use it. He's just really good at controlling and bending mana to his will. As in, Asta and Veto would clash, and now that Asta was using Mana Zone, he would be sufficiently faster and stronger than Veto. And despite this being a bloodlusted third eye awakened Veto, Asta would be easily humiliating this man. Veto would throw many strikes, but they would all be dodged or just simply blocked. Even when Veto used his maximum speed, Asta would just be faster, and Veto would be left open, and Asta would slice him with his blades. Even when Veto used his maximum amount of strength, Asta would simply put up his sword, blocking Veto's punches, and Asta would use his swords to land blows on Veto. Asta would continue to disrespect Veto for the next couple of minutes while all the Black Bulls arrived where they were fighting. And despite Asta landing many life-threatening slashes on Veto, he would not go down, until Asta would finally decide that he was going to end the fight. Asta would continue to fight off Veto as he would cut him across his chest and he would jump back and he would look at Vanessa and Finrod and he would tell them to get everyone out of here, because he was about to use a really big attack that could destroy this entire area and more. They would quickly listen as Asta continued fighting Veto. Everyone would be gathered up and Finrod would create a portal which everyone would pass through and it would take them to the farthest location from there. Upon everyone getting out of the room, Asta would jump back away from Veto and he would let his swords dispel, as Asta's grimoire would flip open and it would flip to the back pages. Asta, still using Mana Zone, he would put his hand up as light particles began to flow around it. As the ground began to crack under Asta, Veto knew if he got hit by the spell, it was over for him. So in one last-ditch effort, he would start blitzing toward Asta, but then Asta would say, "God's divine light," as a ginormous white beam of light would be shot from Asta's hand, as it would envelop the entire room, including Veto. And when I say ginormous, I mean that in every literal sense. Everything standing in front of Asta that got hit by the light beam was completely vaporized. And the beam wouldn't stop there, it would continue going as it would rip through the entire temple and it would even slam into the barrier, as this one attack would shake the entire island which the underwater temple was on. And people above on the beach could even feel the shaking. But eventually the attack would fade away. And all of the Black Bulls, Captain Yami, and even Asta himself were shocked, and they all thought he went a little bit overboard, which he did. And just to put in perspective, if the underwater temple island was hit by this attack head on, it would probably wipe it all out. When this attack is pushed to its absolute limits, it has the power to wipe out like 1/3 of a kingdom. And Veto was completely wiped from existence upon getting hit by the attack. With Veto defeated, the arc would pretty much play out as in canon. Everyone that was injured would be given medical attention, such as luck and magma and blah blah blah. Nero would end up finding the magic stone as she would give it to Asta. Everyone would say their goodbyes and the Black Bulls would leave the underwater temple. And upon the Black Bulls making it back to the hideout, things would go to canon. Yami would take Asta, Charmy, and Finrod to go give a report to the Wizard King. But Finrod would stay with the group instead of splitting off to go flirt with girls. The report would pretty much go toward canon, and as Yami was in the middle of explaining how Veto was, killed, Marx would pop up and he would explain that Chiton was being attacked by the Diamond Kingdom. Yami would request to be sent, like in canon, and Julius would comply. Finrod would make a portal to Chiton, and everyone would make their way through. But before Finrod closed the portal, Asta would tell him to keep it open. This wasn't going to take very long. Asta's grimoire would open as he began to use Mana Zone. He would then clasp his hands together and he would say Binding Light Configuration. As chains of light would begin to form and wrap around most, if not all, of the Diamond Kingdom mages. This is including all 3 of the Shining Generals. As then beams of light would begin to form above all of the restrained Diamond Kingdom mages, as they would rain down on them, and with them restrained, they couldn't really do anything, and they would be put out of commission while also being captured. But much like in canon, Lotus would get away because we all know he is a master at the secret Joestar technique of running away. As then all of the Golden Dawn, including Vengeance, would come to a sudden halt, as they seen all of the Diamond Mages handled so easily. As then all of their eyes would peer toward Asta. Some would be pissed off, and some would be amazed. Even Yuno, Klaus, and Mimosa were surprised that he was able to restrain and take down just about all of them at once. And Vengeance would look at Asta very ominously, as Asta would return the look because he sensed there was something off about Vengeance, something very familiar about him. But Asta would shut his grimoire as he walked back through Finrod's portal. From here, Yami seeing that pretty much everything was handled, he would walk back through the portal, and Charmy would walk back through the portal pretty angry that she didn't get to see Yuno. And before Finrod got to walk back through the portal, him and his brother Longris would lock eyes, before this would be broken by Finrod walking into the portal and shutting it behind him. Yami would get done with his report, and the Black Bulls would actually get enough stars to get them out of the negatives. A few days would pass, and the Black Bulls would be called in for another mission to get another magic stone. And this magic stone was in the Forest of the Witches. So Yami would construct a squad to go retrieve this magic stone. It would consist of Asta, Noelle, Finrod, and most importantly, Vanessa, since she was born and is from the Forest of the Witches. So the team would make their way over to the Forest of the Witches, and Vanessa would call out in front of the gate for it to open up, much like she did when she was trying to find a cure for Asta's arms in canon. As just then, the doors would open up, and a large group of crows would surround the group, and they would take them. The group of crows would carry the Black Bulls through the forest and into a building, much like they did with Vanessa. The crows would drop the Black Bulls and disband, and as all the Black Bulls looked around, they would then see the Queen of the Witches. She would say that this was so imperfect, and she would then ask Vanessa what she wanted and why she brung these people here. As then the Queen of the Witches would lay her eyes on Asta, and something felt very off about Asta. From his physical appearance to his mana, it was almost a deja vu sensation for her, almost as if she's seen this before. Asta would then take note of her earring, and he would then speak up and he would say, "All we want is the magic stone you're wearing." The Queen of the Witches would then say, "What an imperfect request. Perhaps a trade." As just then, Asta and the Queen of the Witches would sense something. As screens made out of mana would pop up and it would show the Eye of the Midnight Sun with Fauna in tow approaching the forest. And along with that, on the other side of the forest, Diamond Kingdom mages with 2 Shining Generals would be coming as well. Asta would then look back at the Queen of the Witches and he would say, "If we get rid of the Eye of the Midnight Sun and the Diamond Kingdom mages, we will get the magic stone, alright?" The Queen of the Witches, not really being in the position to turn down help when it's standing right in front of her, she would accept this. The Black Bulls would make it into the forest, and Asta would tell Finrod, Vanessa, and Noelle to fend off against the Diamond Kingdom mages as best as they could, as Asta was going to try to quickly take out all of the Eye of the Midnight Sun and make it back to them, since he knew they probably couldn't take out all of the Diamond Kingdom mages since they had 2 shining generals with them. He also told them if they got into a bad situation and he wasn't over there by then, they should retreat. So Asta would go in one direction, and Finrod, Vanessa, and Noelle would go in the other. The Diamond Mages would begin to attack the forest, and the witches would begin to fight back against them, as Noelle, Finrod, and Vanessa would arrive. Noelle would use her Sea Dragon's lair to protect Finrod, Vanessa, and herself while she shot water balls at the Diamond Kingdom mages. And Finrod and Vanessa being protected by Noelle's Sea Dragon's lair, Finrod would begin to redirect the Diamond Kingdom mages' attacks back at them with his portals. And Vanessa would try to use her strings to restrain the Diamond Kingdom mages. And the witches from the forest would still be fighting against the Diamond Kingdom mages as well. I gotta stop saying Diamond Kingdom mages. And with this, they were able to take out all the fodder Diamond Kingdom mages, only leaving the 2 shining generals. I promise that's the last time I say it. But Mars and Ladros would be the only 2 left standing. But on the other side of the forest, Fauna and the Eye of the Midnight Sun would begin to attack the forest as well. As in, light orbs would zip through the air, hitting a few of the Eye of the Midnight Sun members, exploding and taking them out. As Fauna and the rest of the Eye of the Midnight Sun members would look up as their gaze would be met by Asta floating above them. Asta would summon a Demon Destroyer sword to his hand, as in one flash of light he would disappear and reappear behind another Eye of the Midnight Sun member, slamming his Demon Destroyer sword into him, knocking him down to the ground. Asta would quickly turn, sending air slashes from his Demon Destroyer sword at another Eye of the Midnight Sun member. The air slashes would connect, cutting him all over his body and taking him out, leaving only Fauna left. Fauna would then shoot a giant fireball from Salamander's mouth at Asta. Asta would then drop and dispel his Demon Destroyer sword and exchange it for a Demon Dweller sword. He would then put his Demon Dweller sword up, absorbing the fireball from Salamander. As in one flash of light, Asta would appear above Fauna and he would say, "Maybe you can answer my question, because your last friend wasn't so talkative before he met his end." Fauna, hearing Asta talk down and bad about Veto, she would be enraged as her third eye would awaken. Asta would be surprised that she lost her cool so quickly, since the last guy only awakened his third eye after losing an arm. As then Fauna's Salamander evolved and shot an even bigger fireball at Asta. Asta would then shoot the fireball that he just absorbed at this fireball. And surprisingly enough, as the 2 fireballs clashed, it would be a draw. Despite Asta multiplying the fireball many times over, this evolved Salamander had enough power to counter it. As then Fauna and her Salamander's mana began to set the air on fire, and Salamander continued shooting large fireballs at Asta. Asta would quickly use Mana Zone as he would begin to blitz out of the way of these fireballs, and he continued to keep his distance so he wasn't caught up by the sheer heat of the mana. And due to Salamander's onslaught of attacks, Asta could not use a spell of his own or he would be caught up by an attack. So Asta would think quickly and then he would try something, as a beam of light would shoot from behind Salamander, catching Fauna off guard. Asta was still flying around, dodging all of Salamander's attacks. He never even went behind Salamander once. And all that happened is, well, since Asta is using Mana Zone, everything in his Mana Zone is basically an extension of himself. Meaning when he is using Mana Zone, he can shoot any spell he wants from any point that is inside of his Mana Zone. This is basically the equivalent of him shooting a light beam from his physical body. The simplest explanation I can give to you is he can use any spell wherever he wants if that location is inside of his Mana Zone. But Fauna being caught off guard by this, she couldn't really do anything, and Salamander would be hit by this powerful light beam, as it would explode on contact and also blow a hole right through Salamander. As then Fauna and the remains of Salamander would plummet to the ground. But on the other side of the forest, with Noelle, Finrod, and Vanessa, they would begin to fight the 2 shining generals. Well, they would begin to fight Ladros. Mars would kind of just sit out and watch the fight, because he did not see it necessary to fight these Clover Kingdom mages. It was not part of his mission. His only mission was to get the Queen of the Witches. But Ladros alone would be easily beating Noelle, Vanessa, and Finrod. He could absorb any attack that Noelle threw at him. He was also too strong to be binded by any of Vanessa's strings, and his beams were too fast for Finrod to counter and redirect with his portals. Noelle couldn't even defend herself or the others since he could just absorb her Sea Dragon's lair. So the 3 would begin to retreat. But before they could, Ladros would blitz toward Finral, punch him in the stomach, putting him down. As then he would raise his hand ready to shoot beams at Noelle. Vanessa in a panic would use her threads to try to stop him, but they would easily be snapped. As Ladros would laugh maniacally, Vanessa would know this was the end. But Vanessa would begin to have memories of all the times that the Queen Witch told her that she apparently had the ability to change fate. So in one final attempt, Vanessa would muster up a new spell, her Red Thread of Fate spell. It would take the form of a cat as it would tap Noelle on the back, as Ladros would shoot the beams and they would apparently hit Noelle and kill her. But suddenly Noelle was alright again, and events would begin to replay themselves. Ladros would shoot his beams again, but except this time they would miss. Ladros would be confused and he would try to do this again, but the cat would come by and tap Noelle on her head, as the same thing would happen from before. She would be hit and apparently she would be killed, but things would replay themselves and the beams would miss the second time. Ladros would try to hit Finrod with the beams, but the cat would come by, tapping Finrod. The beams would hit the first time, but events would replay themselves and they would miss the second time. As in, Ladros would get pissed off and he would aim his beams toward the witches. The witches were too far away from Vanessa's cat, so she couldn't even save them if she wanted to. Ladros would shoot the beams at the witches, but that's when Mars would step in, blocking them with his mineral sword. Mars would explain to Ladros that the witches that lived in the forest had nothing to do with the mission, they were only after the queen of the witches. Ladros would deem Mars as a traitor as the two would begin to get ready to fight. But before they could, Ladros would be hit by a sea dragon's roar from Noelle. And this was actually too much mana for Ladros to absorb at once, so he would be put down for a few minutes. Mars would look over at Noelle and Vanessa, who was helping Finrod up, and he would explain to them that that wasn't going to be enough to get rid of him. They were going to need help from someone who was way stronger. Vanessa would be hesitant, but she would remember that Mars protected the witches and was even willing to go toe-to-toe with his own comrade because he was attacking innocents. So then Vanessa would tell Mars that they had a squad member on the other side of the forest that could probably put him down for good. So everyone would use the time that they had while Ladros was down to make their way to the other side of the forest where Asta was. Just around the time that they were making it there, Asta would have dropped to the ground and began to walk toward Fauna. But right as he was doing this, the group would come out of the woods. Asta would quickly turn, seeing Mars, and he would raise his hand ready to shoot a spell at him, but Noelle would interject and she would explain that he was an ally at the moment. As then Finrod would tell Asta that there was somebody coming, someone that could absorb magic and was crazy strong. Asta, after hearing this, he would then recognize Mars. Mars was the same diamond mage that he beat back in the dungeon. But much like in canon, Mars would see Fauna, and he would have all of his memories of Fauna and blah blah blah, and he would begin to rush toward her. And despite the sheer heat of the air because of the mana, he would still muster through it, making it to Fauna. He would then hug her just like he did in canon, and she would prepare an attack to throw at Mars, but it would get dispelled as her third eye would disappear and her pointy ears would also disappear. As then Fauna would be reverted back into her human form. Right after that, all the burning mana in the air would fade away, as then the remains of Salamander would fade into pure mana and group up, as then Salamander, who was now pure mana, would fade away, leaving Fauna. But while this was happening, Ladros would peer above the trees as he shot beams toward Mars. Asta, seeing this, would appear in front of Mars and Fauna, and he would swipe away the beams with the Demon Dweller sword. Asta would then blitz toward Ladros, kicking him in the chest, sending him cratering into the ground. Asta would then loom over Ladros menacingly, before sending a barrage of light spears and light swords at him. Ladros would absorb it all before spitting it back out at Asta in one large beam of light. Asta would put out his Demon Dweller sword, absorbing it all. After Asta absorbed all of the light beam, he would say, "Neat trick. Unfortunately for you, I can do it as well." As in, Asta's Demon Dweller sword would be jolted forward, and a large beam of light would be shot from it, even bigger than the last one. It would hit Ladros and would be way too much for him to absorb. The light beam would crater Ladros even more into the ground as it would fade away. Asta would drop down as he looked upon the vaporized and unconscious Ladros. From here, the arc would pretty much play out like in canon. Fauna would explain that she was pretty much being controlled and whatnot. The Witch Queen would appear, and since she didn't have Asta under her control like in canon, she didn't have the obligations to betray everyone. So she would hold up her end of the deal, and she would give Asta the magic stone. Asta would explain that the Eye of the Midnight Sun only came here for this stone, and from there, the Witch Queen would pretty much explain what she did in canon. How magic stones granted tons of magic power, but only members of the elf tribe could wield them proficiently. So she would come to the conclusion that the Eye of the Midnight Sun had to be related to the elves in some way. And after the Witch Queen seeing Asta's magic, she would pretty much know that he was an elf, but she wouldn't really mention it. From here, all the Eye of the Midnight Sun members would be captured, Mars would gather up Lajaros and all of the Diamond Kingdom mages and set off. Fauna didn't really have a place in any kingdom, so she would be setting off by herself. And the Black Bulls, with the captured Eye of the Midnight Sun members in tow, would leave back to the Clover Kingdom, with Asta completing his mission successfully and delivering a magic stone along with a bunch of captured Eye of the Midnight Sun members to the Wizard King. Himself and the Black Bulls included would be rewarded 20 golden stars. And that is where I'm going to be leaving this what if off. Now yes, it got super rushed in some points, but I finally got it done and now it is going to be coming out soon. And if this part gets enough support, which I most definitely think it will, part 3 will be coming out and I will get even farther into the story. And also, as you see on screen, we are 5 subscribers away from hitting 1K. At the beginning of this recording, we were at like 969, and now we're almost at 1K. Also, the support of part 1 of this what if grew even more, so just all around thank you guys for the support to the channel. My Discord is linked in the description below. There you can see sneak peeks, talk to me personally, and whatnot. And with all that said, bye.